If you could travel back in time to the Roman Forum in the year 100 AD, you would be standing in the center of the human universe. The marble was white, the legions were undefeated, and the economy was booming. Citizens of Rome believed their empire was eternal. They called it Roma Eterna, Rome the Eternal. They believed the laws of physics applied to them, but the laws of economics did not. They were wrong. We often are taught that Rome fell because of what happened on its borders. The barbarian invasions, the Visigoths, the Huns. But the rot started centuries earlier, not on the battlefield, but in the mint. Before a single barbarian stepped foot inside the city gates, Rome had already destroyed itself from the inside out. This is the story of the first great monetary collapse in history. It is a story of greed, mathematical ignorance, and the destruction of the middle class. And it starts with a single silver coin called the denarius. To understand the fall, you have to understand the rise. When Rome was just a republic, it introduced the denarius in 211 BC. This wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a promise. It contained roughly 4.5 grams of pure silver. It was heavy, it felt real in your hand. This coin was the fuel of the empire. Because it was high-quality silver, it was accepted everywhere, from the foggy coasts of Britain to the trade routes of Syria. A merchant in Egypt didn't need to trust the Roman Senate. He just needed to trust the silver content of the coin. This trust created the greatest free trade zone the world had ever seen. But empires are expensive beasts. As Rome expanded, the costs grew exponentially. Rome needed to pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed thousands of miles away. It needed to build aqueducts, pave 50,000 miles of roads, and provide bread and circuses to keep the population of Rome happy. For a long time, they paid for this with the spoils of war. When Rome conquered Carthage or Greece, they hauled back gold and silver, but eventually the expansion slowed down. The loot dried up, but the bills kept coming. The turning point came with Emperor Nero in the 1st century AD. Nero was not a man of austerity. He built the Golden House, a palace so vast it had its own artificial lake. He needed money, and he didn't want to raise taxes because taxes make powerful people angry. So Nero had a brilliant idea. He ordered the mint to collect the tax coins, melt them down, and remix them with 10% cheaper base metals like copper. He reduced the silver purity from 100% to 90%. To the average citizen, the coin looked the same. It had the same face, the same name, but Nero had essentially created free money. If he had enough silver for 100 coins, he could now mint 110. He spent the extra coins on his projects. This was the birth of inflation. When you increase the number of coins without increasing the amount of goods to buy, prices rise. But at 90% purity, the economy could handle it. It was a slow leak. But once a government realizes it can print money to pay its bills, it cannot stop. It becomes an addiction. By the time of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the wars were getting harder and more expensive. The purity dropped to 75% under Emperor Septimius Severus, who famously told his sons to enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. The silver content dropped to 50%. Think about that. In a few generations, half the wealth of every saver in Rome was stolen. If you buried a jar of old denarii in your garden, you were rich. If you held the new coins, you were poor. Then came the crisis of the 3rd century. This was the point of no return. By 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the denarius was 95% copper. It was a fraud. The coins were washed in a thin layer of silver that rubbed off after a few weeks of use. The consequences were terrifying. We call it hyperinflation. Prices didn't just double, they exploded. Wheat that cost 6 or 7 drachmas in the 2nd century cost 120,000 drachmas in the 3rd century. The economy ceased to function. Soldiers, realizing their pay was worthless, began looting their own towns to survive. Merchants stopped accepting coins. Rome, the most advanced economy in history, reverted to a barter system. People were trading chickens for shoes because the currency was dead. In a desperate attempt to fix it, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD. He passed a law listing the price of everything, beef, grain, labor, and said that anyone charging more would be executed. It didn't work. You cannot legislate the value of money. Merchants simply hid their goods. The markets went empty. People starved. By the time the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, the empire was a hollow shell. The military couldn't be paid, the roads couldn't be fixed, and the people had no stake in the system anymore. The barbarians who came to the gates demanded payment to leave. But they knew the Roman currency was trash. They demanded 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver bullion. They didn't want the coins with the emperor's face. They wanted real value. Rome fell because it forgot the most basic rule of economics. Sound money is the foundation of a civil society. When you destroy the currency, you destroy the trust that holds a nation together. Rome was the first to play this game, but they weren't the last. 1,000 years later, a new empire would rise. Backed by more silver than Rome could have ever imagined, they would make the exact same mistake. History tells us that poverty destroys nations. But history also has a stranger lesson. Wealth can be just as deadly. In the 16th century, Spain was the master of the world. It was the first empire on which the sun never set. Spanish galleons sailed every ocean. Spanish infantry, the tercios, were feared on every battlefield. And unlike Rome, which had to fight for every ounce of silver, Spain stumbled upon the greatest lottery win in human history. They found a mountain made of money. But within 3 generations, the richest empire on earth was bankrupt, broken, and irrelevant. This is the story of the Spanish paradox, how an endless river of silver didn't make Spain rich, but instead destroyed its soul, its industry, and finally, its empire. The year was 1545. In the highlands of what is now Bolivia, a local stumbled upon a mountain called Potosi. It was a geological freak of nature, a cone of earth packed with incredibly pure silver ore. The Spanish immediately industrialized it. Potosi became the mining capital of the world. For the next century, nearly 60% of all the silver on earth came from this one location. The wealth was staggering. Each year, convoys of ships, the famous treasure fleets, crossed the Atlantic. They carried hundreds of tons of silver bars and minted coins. The silver was turned into the piece of 8, the Spanish dollar. It became the first true world currency, used in markets in China, India, Europe, and the Americas. Imagine being the king of Spain. You don't need to tax your peasants. You don't need to develop industry. You don't need to innovate. You just need to wait for the ships to arrive. It seemed like the ultimate blessing. But in economics, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Here is the mechanism that killed Spain. The more money you have, the less that money is worth. As this tsunami of silver hit Spain, the laws of supply and demand kicked in. Silver was no longer scarce. So its purchasing power collapsed. Spain experienced what historians call the price revolution. The cost of living in Spain skyrocketed. A pair of shoes in Spain cost 10 times what it cost in France or England. This destroyed Spanish industry. If you were a Spanish landowner, why would you build a factory? Labor was too expensive. Materials were too expensive. And why would anyone buy Spanish cloth when English cloth was half the price? Spain stopped making things. They became a nation of consumers. They used their American silver to buy furniture from France, weapons from Germany, and textiles from the Netherlands. The silver flowed into Spain and flowed right back out to their rivals. A Spanish observer at the time wrote, "Spain is like a mouth that receives the food, chews it, and passes it on to the other organs, retaining no nourishment for itself. This is what economists today call Dutch disease, but Spain was the first global victim. They hollowed out their own economy because the easy money made hard work unprofitable. You would think, with all that silver, the king would at least be debt-free. But the opposite happened. Because the king expected the treasure fleet to arrive every year, he spent money before he had it. King Philip II saw himself as the defender of Catholicism. He fought wars against the Ottomans, the French, the English, and the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. War is expensive. Philip borrowed heavily from German and Italian bankers, promising to pay them back when the ships arrived. But sometimes the ships were late. Sometimes they were sunk by storms. Sometimes they were captured by pirates. The interest payments piled up. The debt grew faster than the silver could be mined. In 1557, despite controlling the richest mines in the world, Philip II did the unthinkable. He declared sovereign default. He told the bankers, "I cannot pay." It sent a shockwave through Europe. But he didn't stop spending. He defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. The richest man in the world was a serial bankrupt. Every default raised the interest rates for the next loan. It became a death spiral. To pay the troops, they eventually began minting coins made of copper instead of silver, the vellon. They debased the currency just like Rome, not because they lacked resources, but because they lacked discipline. By the 17th century, the party was over. The mines at Potosi began to dry up, but the Spanish economy had forgotten how to work. They had no factories, no banking system of their own, and a population that had grown accustomed to living off the state's imperial wealth. When the easy money stopped, the empire collapsed. The territories broke away. The military crumbled. Spain spent the next 300 years as a second-rate power, a cautionary tale of economic mismanagement. Spain proved that money is not wealth. Money is just a claim on wealth. Real wealth is production, industry, and hard work. Spain tried to cheat the system with a mountain of silver, and the system crushed them. But the next empire to rise would build its power not on silver mines, but on something much more complex, credit, and they would fall just as hard. If Rome was built on military might and Spain was built on resource extraction, the British Empire was built on something more subtle, trust. At its peak in the 1920s, Britain controlled 1/4 of the planet. But the true source of its power wasn't just the Royal Navy, it was the pound sterling. For 100 years, the phrase, "safe as the Bank of England," wasn't just a saying, it was the bedrock of the global economy. The pound was the world's reserve currency. It was backed by gold. It was unshakable. London was the banker to the world. But in the span of just 30 years, a single generation, Britain lost it all. They went from being the masters of the universe to a nation begging for a bailout. This didn't happen because they lost a war. In fact, they won the wars. They lost the peace because they broke the golden rule of finance. You cannot remain a superpower if you become a debtor. To understand what Britain lost, we have to understand the gold standard. Before 1914, if you had a £5 note, you could walk into the Bank of England and exchange it for a specific weight of physical gold. This discipline kept the government honest. They couldn't just print money to fund a new palace or a colony. They had to raise taxes or borrow real gold. This created low inflation and massive stability. The world traded in pounds because the pound was as good as gold. Then came 1914, World War I. Total war is incredibly expensive. To pay for the shells, the tanks, and the soldiers, Britain had to suspend the gold standard. They started printing paper money, IOUs. They borrowed massive amounts from their own citizens and, crucially, from the United States. By the time the war ended in 1918, Britain was victorious but financially broken. The national debt had increased tenfold. The prices in the shops had doubled. The sound money was gone. After the war, the British leadership made a fatal error. They were proud. They wanted to turn back the clock. Winston Churchill, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, decided in 1925 to put Britain back on the gold standard. But he did it at the pre-war price. He ignored the fact that the economy had changed, that they had printed too much money. He tried to force the reality to fit his nostalgia. It was a disaster. The pound was overvalued. British exports became too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Factories closed. Coal miners went on strike. The economy stagnated while the rest of the world roared in the 1920s. Britain was trying to act like a rich creditor when it was actually a poor debtor. Finally, in 1931, the market broke them. Investors lost confidence and rushed to pull their gold out of London. Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard forever. The pound devalued instantly. The credibility was shattered. Then came World War II. If World War I cracked the foundation, World War II bulldozed the house. Britain spent everything to defeat Hitler. They sold their overseas investments. They shipped their gold reserves to America to buy weapons. By 1945, Britain had won the war, but the US dollar had taken the crown. At the Bretton Woods Conference, the dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. The torch had been passed, not voluntarily, but by bankruptcy. What followed was a slow, humiliating decline. In the 1950s and 60s, Britain tried to maintain its empire, but the math didn't work. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the United States threatened to crash the British pound if Britain didn't withdraw its troops from Egypt. Britain had to comply. It was the moment the world realized the British Empire was truly over. They no longer had financial sovereignty. The devaluation continued. In 1967, the Prime Minister went on television to tell citizens that the pound in your pocket was worth less. By the 1970s, inflation hit 25%. The country was paralyzed by strikes. It became the sick man of Europe. In 1976, the ultimate humiliation occurred. The United Kingdom had to ask the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The nation that once owned the world was now on life support. Britain proved that you cannot print your way out of debt. They proved that military victory means nothing if you bankrupt yourself to achieve it. They fell from the dizzying heights of global hegemony to a mid-sized island nation in record time. And as the British sun set, a new star had already risen in the west. The United States had taken the mantle. But today, the United States is following the exact same script that destroyed the pound. This brings us to the present day. The United States serves as the current global empire, holding the reserve currency. And the warning lights that flashed for Rome, Spain, and Britain are now blinking red for America. We are living through the fourth turn of the cycle. The US dollar became the global standard in 1944. It was designed to be better than the British pound. It was backed by gold at $35 an ounce. It was the anchor of the global financial system. But, like its predecessors, America eventually wanted to spend more than it earned. It started in the 1960s. The U.S. government wanted to fund a massive war in Vietnam and massive social programs at home, the guns and butter policy. They didn't have the tax revenue for both, so they printed the difference. By the late 1960s, foreign nations noticed the math didn't add up. There were more paper dollars in circulation than there was gold in Fort Knox. France called the bluff and demanded their gold back. In 1971, President Nixon responded by closing the gold window. He severed the link between the dollar and gold. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith and credit. It was the same moment Rome switched to copper coins. It was the same moment Britain left the gold standard. At the time, they said it was temporary. It wasn't. The system survived for 50 years because of the petrodollar, a deal where oil was sold exclusively in dollars, forcing the world to hold U.S. currency. But the debt kept climbing. from 900 billion in 1980 to 27 trillion in 2020. Now, in 2025, the debt exceeds $36 trillion. It is an accelerating curve that cannot be stopped. Since 2008, and particularly during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars out of thin air. We were told inflation wouldn't happen. We were told this time was different. It wasn't. Inflation struck hard in 2022, debasing the purchasing power of every American family. The cost of housing, food, and energy soared. This is the modern version of Nero's debasement. Globally, the sharks are circling. In 2000, 70% of global reserves were in dollars. Today, that number has dropped below 58%. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is actively building a non-dollar trading infrastructure. They are trading oil in yuan. They are buying gold at record paces. They are preparing for a post-dollar world. They know the history. They know that no fiat currency has ever survived forever. Simultaneously, the U.S. suffers from Roman-style overextension, 800 military bases and costly wars funded entirely by debt. The interest payments on the U.S. national debt are now higher than the entire defense budget. The empire is eating itself. Once you identify the pattern, it is impossible to ignore. Every economic collapse of an empire follows these 7 identical stages. Stage 1, dominance, sound money and military strength. Stage 2, overextension, taking on more than you can afford. Stage 3, deficit spending, borrowing to maintain the illusion of prosperity. Stage 4, debasement, diluting the currency to pay the bills. Stage 5, inflation, the loss of purchasing power. Stage 6, loss of confidence, the world seeks alternatives. Stage 7, collapse, a systematic reset. The United States is currently deep in Stage 5 and showing signs of Stage 6. History suggests 3 endings. First, a controlled decline like Britain, a painful adjustment where the standard of living drops but the nation survives. Second, a chaotic collapse like Rome, a complete breakdown of social and political order. Or third, a painful restructuring to a new monetary system, perhaps a digital currency or a return to hard assets. The difference today is the scale. The dollar is the global reserve. Its failure won't just hurt America, it will shock the entire planetary economy. Every supply chain, every bank, every retirement fund is tied to the value of the dollar. The pattern is absolute. You cannot print wealth. You cannot borrow infinitely. You cannot debase your money without consequences. Rome, Spain, and Britain all thought they were special. They all ignored the math. The United States is doing the same. The laws of economics are like gravity. You can ignore them for a while, but eventually you hit the ground. The only questions remaining are, when does the confidence finally break? And how fast will the unraveling be? If you want to understand the future, you must look at the past. The pattern is nearing completion. I'm Tom, and this is The Wealth Collapse. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be one of the few who saw it coming.